going to talk to you a little bit about the research I have going on in the greenhouse right behind us here. I'm looking at reclamation of well pads in the Wyoming basin, and we're working with the invasive plant halogeton, which is a problem out there, and we're trying to find ways that we can replace halogeton with native vegetation. So we're looking at 11 native species, and you have them on your handout here, which is coming around. And I'd like to mention, go ahead and grab an extra handout if someone hasn't been able to make it and you'd like to pass it on. So we have 11 native species, and we're looking for something that we can replace halogeton with. And we're looking at things like, is there a certain species that does better when it's grown with halogeton? And are there certain growth characteristics that these species have that allow them to compete with halogeton? So I said halogeton is an invasive plant. What does that mean? Well, two things. One, an invasive plant is non-native, so it's occurring outside of its native range. And then two, it's causing some kind of harm. And these harms can come in many different forms. One of those harms is economic. So there was a study done in the 1990s that looked at what the cost is to the US from invasive species. And this group looked at everything from aquatic invasive species, they looked at human diseases, and they came up with a figure. And this figure was $137 billion of annual cost to the US. That's quite staggering. That's due to invasive species in aggregate. So invasive species are a serious problem. And halogeton is one of these invaders. And halogeton has some definite costs associated with it. And one of those costs is loss of livestock, because halogeton is a toxic plant. Halogeton produces toxic oxalates in its foliage, and it's toxic to cattle, sheep, and horses, and has caused extensive livestock die-off in the past. But there's other costs associated with invasive species beyond just money, and these things are hard to get a handle on and agree. These things are like ecosystem services. So these are things that we depend on and that we take for granted. They're hard to value, and we cannot replace them. These things are like nutrient cycling or water retention on the landscape. And invasive species frequently negatively impact these services that we depend on and cannot replace. So, who here knows about halogeton? A couple people? Okay, so I brought some halogeton that I've been growing in the greenhouse here. And this halogeton is about 2.5 months old, and it's pretty small. So you might want to come up and take a look later. Otherwise, you can check it out in the greenhouse right behind us there. So halogeton is an annual plant. That means it only lives for 1 year. It's a succulent, and it has these sausage-shaped leaves. And it looks like a nice-looking plant. It's pretty, and it's colorful, but it has a lot of harms associated with it. Another harm that halogeton is associated with is another economic harm, specifically why this project was initiated, is in the Wyoming basin. It tends to invade and persist in harsh sites, so areas that are dry and arid, areas that are often salt affected. And when a reclamation specialist comes in and applies seed, it's a very expensive process. It's labor intensive. You got to travel far to get out there. Seed's not cheap. And oftentimes halogeton stubbornly resists any attempts to get native vegetation to grow there. It'll just pop right up the next year, and our native vegetation just never really establishes. So I have field sites in Warmsutter, which is just west of Rawlins, where I'm working with Marathon Oil to attempt to improve reclamation success where halogeton is a particular problem. So another cost that halogeton is associated with is it can harm the soil. That is, that it can increase the salt content of the soil surface. So what it does is it takes from the root system It takes salt and it brings that up into the vegetative parts, and then being an annual plant, it dies back, and those tissues then decompose on the soil surface, enriching it in salt. And that makes it very difficult for us to establish our desirable vegetation. It slows water infiltration, and seedlings simply don't do well in that environment. Halogeton may be doing that for its own benefit. It has a nickname, and that's salt lover. And it's been actually found growing at the base of crude salt piles along the Great Salt Lake. So it's incredible how it can deal with these salty soils, and it also creates them. Another problem with halogeton in reclamation is once it gets to a site, it just produces a huge amount of seed. So a dense stand of halogeton in a 1 acre area can produce something like 400 pounds of seed. And to put that in perspective, a reclamation specialist coming in would put something in the neighborhood of 15 to 35 pounds of seed down. So you're already overwhelmed with so many more halogeton seed than our native species. Halogeton is also a dimorphic seed producer, so 2 kinds of seeds. One of those seeds is a black seed, and it only lasts for 1 year. It's limited viability, but it produces a second kind of seed, a brown seed. And this brown seed tends to be dormant the first few years, and it may wait up to 10 years to germinate. So the implications of this is, if you have halogeton come to a site and produce seed, and you want to eradicate it, eliminate it from that area, you're going to have to return every year for 10 years in order to make sure that you've knocked it out. And that's very expensive. So we're looking at competition in the greenhouse, and competition is the opposite of cooperation. It's when species are hurting each other. And what we're looking for is there a native species, or is there some kind of characteristics, like maybe annual plants, because halogeton is an annual. We're thinking maybe annual plants would also compete with halogeton. And can these plants replace halogeton and be an effective form of control, while also helping out the reclamation and the energy producers who are required by law to restore these areas and use native plants? Because in the past, species that have been successful are frequently non-native and sometimes considered even invasive weeds in their own right, like crested wheatgrass. So we're looking at these 11 native species, and I'll tell you a little bit about 3 of them that we have going on right now in the greenhouse. So one of our native species is curly-cup gumweed. And that's this guy right here. And a lot of people consider it a weed. It's got a flexible life strategy. It can be biannual, and it also can be perennial. So it could live just 2 years and complete its life cycle, or it could last a lot longer. And it's considered a weed because when it comes into a rangeland environment that's been disturbed or that has a lot of open ground, it can capture that ground and increase in density and abundance. And it's not palatable for most big game animals. It's not palatable to cattle, sheep, or horses. So in that respect, it's often considered a weed. But it's a native plant, and it belongs in the rangeland environment. And it offers a lot of important resources to other things, like it's important for wildlife. So one increasingly important wildlife species that we hear more and more about here in Wyoming, and particularly in rangelands, is sage-grouse. And it's become known that sage-grouse depend on forbs and insects at the early stage of their life. So between 5 and 12 weeks, sage-grouse need to get extra nutrition. They can't just eat sagebrush like the adults, because they're growing incredibly fast during the summer. And so they depend on forbs and insects. And in central Montana, curly-cup gumweed was found to comprise up to 40%, was found in up to 40% of sage-grouse chick crops. So it's an important plant for sage-grouse. Also, these showy yellow flowers attract pollinators. and it concentrates insects in areas of the rangeland. And that's also beneficial to sage-grouse chicks. It's also utilized by small mammals and birds. And another species that we have here is blanket flower, or Gaillardia aristata. And this one's a perennial forb, so it lasts more than 2 years to complete its life cycle. It's growing actually right outside the greenhouse. You probably walked by it at the sign-in table. You might have seen me grab this. And it's an incredibly beautiful plant for one thing. It was collected by Lewis and Clark as a voucher specimen in Montana because it's just beautiful. It catches your eye. It also provides all kinds of benefits. It's important for upland games and small animals. It's a drought-tolerant plant. This is one I'd recommend if you're looking for something in your flower bed you may consider. It's not palatable to deer, so that's a good thing if you have those pesky city deer. And it's just a wonderful plant. And then last is, this is a grass. This is slender wheatgrass, and it's a more traditional reclamation species. It's a short-lived, perennial, cool season bunch grass. It's short-lived, so it only sticks around for about 5 years. If it doesn't reseed itself, it'll move out and allow other perennial vegetation usually to get on the site. And it provides benefits for our large game animals. It's a good forage plant. It's also palatable for cattle, sheep, and horses. It's an incredibly fast establishing plant. It can capture disturbed sites and hold that ground. So in some cases it's considered a weed, but in these harsh sites you need that. You need a plant that can come in, tolerate these harsh conditions, and grow and produce a good service. So stay tuned. We have the greenhouse study going on. It's been going for about 1 month now, and results keep coming, and we'll have more results and conclusions in the next couple months. Thank you. Yes. Yes, the results will be posted. I'll be writing a master's thesis, and that will be distributed through the library. I know you can get a copy. There may be academic publications too, presentations. Yes?
You said halogen invasive. Where does it come from?
Oh yeah, Halogen is an invader. It's non-native. It's outside of its geographical range, right? So it came from West China or Mongolia, an area that's very similar in climate here to Wyoming.
Was it imported for some reason, or did it just blow here?
Oh, yeah. We don't know exactly how it got here. It was first found in Wells, Nevada in the 1930s, and we don't know why it was brought here or how. It's assumed that it's unintentional introduction. Yes?
What's the sodium absorption ratio that limits all of these native plants?
The exact figure, I'm sorry, I do not know that off the top of my head.
Well, along those oil pads you're talking about have an SAR that's really high.
Yeah, it says that the SAR, sodium absorption ratio, is very high, and that limits native plants. In Warmsutter, I may not be correct, but I'm thinking we're having a range between somewhere like 1 and 3 is our SAR range, right? The well pads that I'm working on.
That'd be low.
That is low. The soil's been mixed there. They've taken subsurface and they've mixed it all around.
So you were saying that it concentrates the salt from the root? It goes up from the roots?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay, so the question is, does halogen concentrate salt, and how does it do that? So when it's collecting water through its root system, the salts dissolve into the water, and that is taken up through the root system, and those are accumulate then in the vegetative parts above ground.
So this doesn't happen with other plants?
No, it can happen with other plants.
It's just that this one's more salt tolerant.
It does have high salt tolerance. I don't know I don't have any exact figures off the top of my head, but there was a study done where they looked at the native soil ecology under native plants versus halogen, and halogen had markedly increased the salinity of the soil surface compared to native plant, and that native plant was winter fat. Amy?
My question is, couldn't you, instead of saying, let's get rid of halogen, couldn't you grow it on purpose and harvest it?
Yeah.
And then get rid of the salt that way. Use it to get rid of the salt.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting idea. I suppose it would be possible, but it's sort of a dangerous proposition to grow halogen. But other people have, along similar lines, said, well, halogen seed could furnish edible oils. Some people have advocated for farming the desert with halogen, but it's kind of a dangerous proposition.